With all the rookie drafts going on right now, people seem to have forgotten about every other player on the teams. So today we're going to start our series where we look at dynasty players by position that you should buy or sell. All right, so today we're talking about dynasty quarterbacks that you should buy right now for your teams. Now, right away, I'll tell you, this is going to be better if you play in a super flex or a two quarterback league, because a couple of guys are kind of fringe starters. One's definitely not a top 12 quarterback, and one has the potential to be a top 5 guy. And the first guy we're going to talk about today has high potential, but isn't quite at the starter level yet. So you'd be looking at acquiring a backup. But anyways, let's kick it off with our number one guy, Tua Tagovailoa, who last year in 9 starts averaged 15.2 fantasy points per game, drops to 14.2 if you consider the disastrous Week 17 performance with all the interceptions, which was not the way he played all season. Either way, the points aren't very good. He's barely a top 30 quarterback in 2020. He averaged, with the Week 17 disaster, 32 pass attempts per game, although he had a good completion rate at 64%. What were the reasons why he didn't have the best season in 2020? Well, he was missing wide receivers for one. Devontae Parker played in only 5 of his 9 starts. Preston Williams, the number 2 wide receiver on the Dolphins in 2020, played in only 2 of his 9 starts. That left him playing with talents such as Jakeem Grant and other wide receivers, and basically having to focus on using tight ends as his number 1 weapons. So Mike Gesicki got a lot of targets, as did other tight ends on the Miami Dolphins in 2020. So second reason he didn't have the best season in 2020 is the coaches really babied him. 32 pass attempts over 16 games is 512, which isn't terrible, but it's not what you're going to want from a fantasy starter. It was 10th fewest in the league. Now, if you take away Week 17, where he threw a lot, got intercepted a lot, and they got destroyed by the Bills, then he's averaging less than 29 pass attempts per game. And in his 16-game season, that would have been 3rd fewest in the league in 2020. But we have to expect that they're going to let him do his thing and throw a lot more in 2021. I personally have faith in Flores, so I don't see why you would look at what he did in 2020 and think that he wouldn't let him do more in 2021. Another big reason to buy now on Tua is his new weapons. They've added Will Fuller, gives him a deep threat. They drafted his college teammate, Jalen Waddle, who has a lot of speed and is being compared to Tyreek Hill. So now you look at his weapons. When healthy, he's going to have Devontae Parker on one side. He's going to have Will Fuller on another side. Jalen Waddle is going to factor in 3 wide receiver sets. Preston Williams is going to be there in 4 wide receiver sets, possibly 3 wide receiver sets, and a solid tight end in Mike Gesicki. That is an offense where a quarterback can succeed when it comes to fantasy. If he gets the 550 or more pass attempts this year, we can see Tua into the conversation for the top 10. But of course, we're talking dynasty, we're talking long-term, and the value right now for Tua is a great point to buy because it's a lot lower than it was last year. Many quarterbacks have struggled in their first year, even guys like Peyton Manning and John Elway. But looking at the more recent guys that we've seen who didn't have the best first years, and people wondered, are they going to be even a starting quarterback in the NFL? Look at Josh Allen. In year 1, he wasn't anything special. He was doing mostly things with his legs. Year 2, still mostly with his legs, but getting better. And then he takes the big leap in year 3, where his passing accuracy went from below 60% to into the mid-60s. That was a huge jump for him. His issue was the passing accuracy. Tua's is just going to be being confident with the offense and getting there. So make sure you try to get yourself some shares of Tua before the season starts, before his value starts going up. Even if you don't need a quarterback, you can then just look to trade him at the end of the season when his value is higher than it is now. So he's a great buy low candidate. Second candidate on this list is Carson Wentz, who Fantasy Pros ranks as the 20th best quarterback, but I have him at 12th overall. Now in 2020, he also wasn't very good. 16.4 fantasy points per game. That's just not going to cut it in this day and age. Barely in the top 25 in fantasy points per game for a quarterback. Although he was better than Matt Stafford and Phillip Rivers, as well as Baker Mayfield. He is replacing Rivers now with the Colts. He had 4 games that he missed in 2020, but not because of injury, because he was benched for Jalen Hurts. So he played a full season in 2019. He missed 4 games because of a benching in 2020. He would have played a full season. So it's safe to assume that his injury history is behind him. Also, up until 2020, he had really taken care of the football. He had 7 interceptions in 2018, 7 interceptions in 2019, and 7 interceptions as far back as 2017. 2020 was the only season where he really racked up a lot more interceptions. And his fantasy points per game has been going down. Started at 21.5 when he had that ridiculous MVP caliber type season. 18.4, 17.9, and then still down to 16.4 in 2020. So trending the wrong way. But he's getting a new start on a new team. And what does this team provide for him? Blocking. He was sacked 50 times in 12 games in 2020. Rivers was sacked 19 times in 16 games in 2020. We're seeing a situation where Wentz is going to go from 50 times sacked to under 20. That's going to give the quarterback a huge confidence boost and is going to allow him to really pick apart defenses. Let's talk about the weapons he's going to get with the Colts. Number 1, T.Y. Hilton, although getting long in the tooth, is still there and can still be a threat down the field to open things up for the other guys. We saw Michael Pittman have some flashes last year, and hopefully he can take that second-year leap and become a better player. And if Paris Campbell can stay healthy, we saw what he was able to do in the slot early in the season with Phillip Rivers, so that'll give him a quick out, similar to what he's had with his tight ends with the Eagles. Compare those to the weapons that he had in 2020, guys like Greg Ward, Jalen Reagor, and Travis Fulgham. I mean, it's not even close. On top of the weapons, he's going to have a chip on his shoulder. Just think about what Aaron Rodgers did in 2020. Now Wentz has lost his job, gotten traded. You best believe he's going to be ready to come play for the Colts in that blocking in 2021. Expect him to be back over 18 fantasy points per game, and that would make him a borderline top 12 quarterback. So if you're looking to acquire him for cheap in a 1-quarterback league, okay, but your best bet is to look to acquire him for less than his value is going to be at the end of next year in a super flex or a 2-quarterback league. Next up on this list is a man who I have ranked as 13th, so just outside the top 12, and Fantasy Pros has ranked as 18th. He averaged 16.2 fantasy points per game in 2020, which was, again, barely top 25 and a little bit behind what Carson Wentz did, and that's Matthew Stafford. So down year in 2020 without Kenny Golladay for most of the season. Matthew Stafford has been an automatic 4,000 yards guaranteed. He's been a high-volume passer, and he's completed over 6% of his passes every year from 2014. Nobody thinks he's a bad quarterback. He's just been stuck on a bad team for a long time. Now he goes to the Rams. So another player who's been traded to a better situation. Wide receivers that you'll have with the Rams: Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, 2 guys that are basically guaranteed 1,000-yard receivers. They came up a little bit short last year, but they were over 1,100 each in 2019. And in 2018, Woods was over. Kupp missed half the season, but was on pace to be over as well. So if we look at Stafford, when he has multiple weapons, was over 20 fantasy points per game when he had both Golladay and Marvin Jones in 2019. Again, just over 16 when he only had Marvin Jones and TJ Hawkinson, who was developing but still not there. So he gets his 2 1,000-yard receivers, goes to a system where they also have something that the Lions have been lacking since Barry Sanders retired, basically, and that's a run game. And the reason that's important is because in the last 4 years, Goff has finished outside the top 20 twice and inside the top 11 twice. The years that he's finished inside the top 11, they've had a top 7 run game. In the years that he's finished outside the top 20, they've had a middle-of-a-pack run game in 2020 because of Akers coming on strong, and a bottom 5 run game in 2019. Akers showed a lot of promise in 2020 near the end of the season, and if he can keep that going, or if he, Darrell Henderson, can combine to give the Rams the run game that Matthew Stafford hasn't had with the Lions, then Matthew Stafford could be looking at being a top 10 quarterback in 2021 and for the foreseeable future as well. The best the Lions have had as a running team in the last 4 years has been bottom 11 in 2019 in yards per carry. Everything else has been worse than bottom 11. Better weapons, better run game, better numbers. Buy low on Matthew Stafford. The last player we're going to go in depth into is a player who, again, is not going to be a starter in one quarterback league, so you can skip ahead to the next segment if you're in a one quarterback league. But in a super flex, he is a player who is going to be able to bounce back from a terrible season where he scored a very low 13.6 fantasy points per game. Now, that number is a bit misleading. We'll get into that as well, because his numbers from 2020, 2019 are fairly similar with one exception, and that's touchdowns. In 2019, he averaged 19.4 points per game, so down almost 6 full points per game. His TD percentage was 2.5% in 2020. Of players who started greater than 8 games, only Sam Darnold and Cam Newton had equal or lower touchdown percentages. Have you guessed who it is yet? It's Daniel Jones. Quarterbacks who had higher touchdown percentages in 2020 were Drew Lock and Nick Foles, and the league average is about 5% every year. In 2019, he was 5.2%. If you give him that 5% in 2020, you finish it with 16.7 fantasy points per game, which still isn't great, but it's better than what we saw from Wentz and Stafford in 2020. So what is the reason that he should take a step forward this year? Still a young player as well. Well, they added Golladay, and they also drafted Kadarius Toney. Now, I don't see Kadarius Toney being right away a difference maker, but Kenny Golladay 100% will be. In the last 2 full seasons that Galladay's played, although he's not a big volume guy, catching only 65 and 70 balls, he's averaging over 1,000 yards, and he brings touchdowns. 11 touchdowns in 2019, only 5 in 2018. But he's going to bring more touchdowns to this offense, which is what Jones lacked in 2020. The numbers were fairly similar. So you look at this lineup that he's going to have Golladay and Slayton on the outside, Shepard and Ingram and Toney underneath. And of course, the big difference from what he didn't have last year as well, a healthy Saquon Barkley. Forces defenses to play the run. That's what happens when you have a running game. We talked about it with Matthew Stafford. If you don't have a running game, defenses don't have to keep you honest in that regard and can play more against the pass. So a healthy Saquon not only forces teams to play against him and opens things up for the other players, but it also gives him another target. In 2019 with Daniel Jones, he had 73 targets, 52 receptions, 438 yards, and 2 touchdowns. So there's another outlet for touchdowns and for yards with Barkley. Well, this is going to be the best offense that Daniel Jones has had. By no means do I think Daniel Jones will be a top 5 or even a top 10 quarterback in 2020 or in the foreseeable future. But in a 2-quarterback league or a super flex league, he's definitely someone to target because he'll be a solid matchup play as your number 2 or number 3 quarterback, and you can get him for cheap. Last thing I want to talk about before we go today is a player, if you're on a win now dynasty team, to target. Now, there would be 2 players, but unfortunately, I can't say for sure you should target Matt Ryan because the Julio Jones situation seems to be going out of Atlanta. And if that's the case, then I wouldn't be looking to target Matt Ryan. If Julio Jones is going to stay in Atlanta and Matt Ryan is going to have Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, Kyle Pitts, Mike Davis, who had a good year in 2020 and should be better than what they had at the running back position in 2020 for the Falcons, he's definitely a buy candidate. Older, but on a win-now team in a super flex or 2-quarterback league, absolutely somebody I would target if Julio stays. And one person I would definitely target is Tom Brady. Last year, I told people to avoid him in redraft leagues because of the uncertainty of going to a new team. He'd played in the system for so long, so how he was going to do in this new system, it just wasn't worth the risk in redraft leagues. And I was telling people to take Rodgers instead. I was right. But Tom Brady played really well. And especially from weeks 10 on, he averaged over 24 fantasy points per game. That's top 5 in the league. In that 7-game stretch, he had 2 games under 16 fantasy points, and they were barely under 16. We're talking 14.6 and 15.6. And all of his games other than that were over 23 fantasy points per game. So fairly consistent, and the down games weren't killing you. The reason for this is he figured out the system. This was a new system to learn. It's the reason why I told people to avoid him in redrafts. But he figured it out, and he'll know it this year because they're bringing every single player back. There's not going to be any changes. It's still Bruce Arians. It's still his system. It's the same wide receivers. They have Antonio Brown. They have Chris Godwin. They have Mike Evans. The run game's going to be the same. They'll have Gronk, and they'll probably have O.J. Howard. But at the same time, it's going to be the same system. So you can expect Tom Brady to be somebody who's knocking on the door of being a top 5 quarterback in 2021. And if you're a win-now team in Dynasty, he's somebody that you should sacrifice a future asset for to get your team in that position to win that championship in your super flex and 2 quarterback leagues. Anyways, that's going to do it for the show today. Hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like, make sure to subscribe, and that's it.